So in the 1900s, wealth taxes were fairly common in Europe, and back in 1990, about a dozen European countries had a wealth tax, but most have since abolished them. Today, only a few OECD countries still levy broad annual wealth taxes, notably Spain, Norway, and Switzerland in Europe. France did as well, but only until 2017, and a couple of others like Colombia. Now, I want to use these examples to try and learn whether wealth taxes actually do work. So, if we begin with France, France's wealth tax was put in place in 1989 and removed in 2017. It taxed multimillionaires and raised some revenue, about 4 to 5 billion euros annually in its later years at least. But it was quite controversial over the years, and an estimated 60,000 millionaires left France, potentially to escape the taxes. Some people argue that the wealth tax hurt France's economy, and in 2018 it was replaced by a narrower tax only on real estate assets. But the story isn't that simple, because France's official evaluation committee found no clear evidence that scrapping the wealth tax boosted investment or growth in the economy. However, what the wealth tax did do was reduce wealth inequality, and France's inequality, as estimated by the Gini coefficient, was lower than that in the UK, thanks to this tax. Now, Norway has had an annual wealth tax for many years, currently around 1.1% at the top end after a recent increase, and it kicks in at about £125,000 equivalent. So even the modest wealth you pay, and thus affects about 500,000 Norwegians. Despite the somewhat low threshold and comparatively high rates, the tax has been stable and continues to raise revenue year over year. In fact, Norway raises about twice as much from its wealth tax as a percentage of GDP as Spain does, even though Spain's top rates are much higher. One concern was whether Norway's recent tax hike would drive the rich away. I mean, there were plenty of headlines about the rich fleeing. In 2022, a record number of wealthy Norwegians, which was actually just 30, did relocate abroad, mostly to Switzerland. But to put that in perspective, that's only 0.01% of Norway's roughly 236,000 millionaires. The other 99.99% stayed, but the tax increase generated far more revenue than was lost from the handful of leavers. Norway's government even introduced a stricter exit tax on people who move and sell assets to ensure those cashing out to leave still pay their dues. The Norwegian case shows that a well-off country can impose a wealth tax with minimal millionaires' flight and continue to fund public services. So to look at Spain, they implemented a national wealth tax in the 1970s, repealed in 2008 and then reinstated in 2011. Spain implemented a national wealth tax in the 1970s, repealed it in 2008, then reinstated it in 2011, initially as a temporary measure, following the financial crisis. It applies to individuals with net wealth above roughly 700,000 euros and has progressive rates that in some regions reach around 2.5% or higher for the ultra-rich. More recently, Spain's government introduced an additional solidarity wealth tax in 2022 on fortunes over 3 million euros. Spain's wealth taxes have significantly increased the revenue collected from the rich. While the tax doesn't make up a huge share of Spain's budget, it still raised about 0.2% of GDP in revenue as of 2022. Spain's case shows that these wealth taxes can benefit the public without driving the wealthy to leave en masse. Now, Switzerland is a unique case. It has long levied wealth taxes at the state and municipal level. Rates vary by state, but they are generally around 0.3% to 1% of net assets annually, often with low exemption thresholds. Despite these taxes, Switzerland remains one of the world's favourite havens for millionaires, boasting a high density of wealthy residents. Clearly, a moderate wealth tax hasn't scared rich people away from Zurich or Geneva. Crucially, Swiss wealth taxes raise a substantial amount of revenue, about 1.1% of GDP or over 4% of total tax revenues, the highest yield of any country's wealth tax. Analysts note that Switzerland's success is due to tax design. Relatively broad bases, with few exceptions, and lower thresholds mean the tax covers more people and assets, albeit at lower rates. Additionally, Switzerland's overall tax mix is gentle on capital. For example, it has no national capital gains tax and minimal inheritance taxes, which may make an annual wealth tax more palatable. The Swiss example demonstrates that a well-designed wealth tax can consistently generate revenue and coexist with a thriving economy full of wealthy individuals. One of the reasons why some countries repealed their wealth taxes was just political and ideological shifts, really. Because in the late 1900s, there was a broad shift towards lower taxes on capital as part of a pro-market, pro-investment policy series. The Reagan-Thatcher era and beyond, So wealth taxes, often dubbed envy taxes by opponents, fell out of favour in an environment where attracting capital and high net worth individuals was a priority. The wealthy also have significant political influence, so through lobbying efforts and political donations, which definitely played a large role in convincing governments to drop wealth taxes. In many cases, repeal was driven by political decisions rather than irrefutable economic evidence of failure. As one review concluded, wealth taxes were often abolished due to, quote, policy, design and administrative issues or political economy factors rather than proven inherent economic harm. This suggests that with different political choices of better design, those taxes might have survived. So why wealth tax then? Well, the gap between the super rich and everyone else has grown very large. Wealth inequality is even more extreme than income inequality in many countries. For example, in the UK, the richest 10% of households own 43% of all wealth, whereas the bottom 50% own just 9%. A wealth tax directly targets this imbalance by requiring those with the greatest fortunes to contribute a slice of their assets to the public purse. It can slow the accumulation of wealth at the top and help prevent a democracy from turning into a plutocracy. Importantly, the revenue from a wealth tax can be redistributed or spent on public services that benefit the broader population, thus indirectly reducing inequality as well. We saw earlier that France's wealth tax coincided with lower inequality, and France has historically had less wealth inequality than countries like the UK or US, arguably due to its more aggressive taxation of high wealth. While a wealth tax alone won't reverse decades of inequality growth, it is a tool specifically calibrated to moderate the concentration of wealth over time. Another argument is just fairness. Everyone should pay tax according to their ability, and these days some of the richest individuals actually pay lower taxes than middle class people. How can a billionaire end up with a lower effective tax rate than a nurse or teacher? The answer is that our current tax systems often favours income from wealth, like capital gains, dividends, or business earnings, with lower rates and loopholes, whereas wage earners pay taxes straight off their payslips. For instance, in Britain, an average person in the bottom 10% of earners ends up paying about 44% of their meagre income in various taxes, while someone in the top 0.01%, i.e. the ultra-rich, pays about 21% of their income. Just look at former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who paid an effective tax rate of only 22% on his £2 million income, whereas a typical doctor in London pays around 40%. This happens because much of the elite's income comes from wealth, profits, stocks, property, taxed lightly, whereas ordinary people's income is mostly wages taxed at standard rates. A wealth tax helps correct this imbalance by taxing the stock of wealth directly. It says if you have £50 million in assets, you can afford to pay a bit more, even if your taxable income, quote-unquote, is minimised. Fairness also extends the idea that all contributions should be mandatory. Relying on philanthropy or voluntary goodwill of the rich doesn't fund schools or hospitals reliably. A wealth tax formalises that responsibility. In essence, it strengthens the social contract. The richest reap the most benefits from society in terms of opportunities, infrastructure, and often monopoly or network effects, so they should give back proportionally. Some people say, wealth taxes don't generate much income. Well, actually, wealth taxes can raise substantial revenue that governments could use for vital services or investments. Take Switzerland, for example. Its wealth tax brings in about 1.1% of GDP. To put that in context, for many countries, 1% of GDP is billions that could fund universal preschool or a green energy transition or a major infrastructure upgrade. The Tax Justice Network recently estimated that copying Spain's new wealth tax on the ultra-rich globally could raise about $2 trillion per year. So thoughts on funding climate action and public healthcare worldwide? For a single country example, they found a similar tax in the UK, a featherlight rate on top of 0.5% richest households, could yield about $31 billion or £24 billion a year. Yes, these are estimates, but they highlight a real opportunity. Tapping into concentrated wealth could provide revenue equivalent to several percentage points of a typical income tax or VAT hike, without squeezing the general working population. In an era where many governments face deficits and pressing investment needs, a wealth tax is one of the few untapped sources of revenue that targets those most able to pay. In the UK, polls show about 78% of people favour greater taxes on those with assets over £10 million, and similar attitudes are found in other countries. Okay, great, so we can raise money to fund social services and invest, but what does a good wealth tax actually look like? Well, to maximise impact and minimise administrative hassle and political resistance, the idea is to set the bar high. The tax should focus on the ultra wealthy, not merely well-off middle class. For example, a threshold of £5 million or £10 million in net assets could be a starting point, ensuring that only a tiny fraction of households are actually affected. The Wealth Tax Commission in the UK recommended that a high threshold makes the tax vastly easier to administer, as at £10 million it would only hit about 0.04% of the population, roughly 20,000 individuals in the UK. This also addresses the grandma with a valuable house problem. The vast majority of people, even many millionaires, wouldn't pay. It's really aimed at multimillionaires and billionaires. Politically, this is way more sellable, and morally, it zeroes in on those with the greatest ability to pay. One of the downfalls of earlier wealth taxes was a Swiss cheese of exemptions. So farms, businesses, artwork, pension funds, etc. While some reliefs can be sensible, so to protect small family businesses or retirement savings, too many carve-outs allow the rich to simply rearrange their assets to avoid tax. The design should include all major asset classes: cash, stocks, bonds, investment funds, real estate, including second homes, mansions, land, ownership, stakes in companies, trusts, jewelry, art collections, boats, etc. Liabilities like mortgages or loans would of course be subtracted. So, as net wealth means assets minus debts. By casting a wide net, the tax treats different types of wealth equally, and taxpayers can't simply swap one form of wealth for another to escape the net. Notably, Switzerland's high revenue wealth tax is partly due to its relatively broad base and low exemption threshold. The fewer exceptions we have, the lower the rate can be to raise the same revenue, which actually makes the tax easier for the wealthy to bear and less tempting to evade. In practice, there might be a few targeted exemptions. For example, some countries might decide not to tax personal pensions or to exclude a certain amount of primary home value to avoid hitting the upper middle class unfairly, but those should be limited and well justified. The guiding principle should be that if it's valuable and you own it, it counts towards your wealth. The rate of wealth tax should be modest, enough to matter but not so high that it genuinely threatens to confiscate wealth or outpace typical investment returns. Many proposals suggest something like 1% per year on fortunes above the threshold, with perhaps a higher band, say 2% or 3% on billionaire level wealth. Spain's solidarity tax, for instance, applies around 1.7% up to 3.5% on the largest fortunes. Those upper rates only hit the likes of centimillionaires, so a featherweight tax around 1% annually on the super rich has been described as almost unnoticeable in terms of lifestyle impact, yet cumulatively powerful for society. So let's look at an example. Someone with £20 million might owe 200k, 1% a year, which sounds like a lot, but if their assets grew even by a conservative 5% that year, which is a £1 million gain, they are still net 800k richer. So if anyone's saying these rates are too high, it's like, come on, like, oh no, I only made 800,000 this year, what will I ever do, So designing the tax is also just one side of the coin, and enforcing is the other. Governments will need to beef up their capacity to track wealth. This could include creating a comprehensive asset registry for high net worth individuals, where they must declare all significant holdings annually. Enforcement also means penalties for evasion, so if a billionaire tries to hide assets or underreport by 30%, they should face hefty fines or even criminal charges. Tools like third-party reporting can aid compliance, for example, banks reporting large account balances or land registries reporting property ownership. International transparency initiatives can greatly assist here, as thanks to global agreements, tax authorities can access data on citizens' overseas financial accounts more easily now, making it harder to stash money in secret. Another idea floated by tax experts is leveraging the private sector's own assessments. For instance, if a wealthy person lowballs the value of their estate to the taxman, the government could share that valuation with insurance companies or banks, who might then be reluctant to lend to them based on such a low net worth, or with local authorities for property tax purposes. Creative measures like this discourage false declarations by making the declared values have broader consequences. Additionally, enforcement can be aided by public support. So if people see the wealth tax as legitimate, there's social pressure on the rich to comply. Adequate resources for the revenue agency are a must, so the extra revenue from the tax should partly be invested in hiring skilled valuers and auditors. We are dealing with a small number of taxpayers as well, so a well-funded specialised unit can handle it perfectly well. To avoid scenarios where the tax unduly harms certain asset-rich but cash-poor individuals, the law can include provisions to ease the burden in special cases. So one approach is an optional deferral. So if a taxpayer's wealth is tied up in an active business or illiquid asset, they could be allowed to defer the tax with interest until a liquidity event like selling the business or property. For example, a farmer with £15 million worth of land, who is land rich but income poor, could defer the annual tax until the land is sold or passed on, at which point the accrued tax and interest is paid from the proceeds. This ensures the wealth tax doesn't force imprudent sales while still eventually capturing the due tax. Another possible measure is capping the tax as a percentage of income for those genuinely in low income situations. Though too generous a cap, and wealthy people will creatively make their income vanish on paper. A modest cap could be a safety valve. Policymakers designing the tax should consult with business owners, farmers, and others to identify genuine hardship scenarios and craft rules accordingly. We must also anticipate and prevent avoidance via relocation. In an ideal world, major economies would jointly implement wealth taxes, making it futile to just hop from country to country. Short of that, however, countries can implement exit taxes, so if a UK resident with significant unrealised gains in assets tries to emigrate and sell off stock, they could be hit with a one-time tax on those gains as if they sold them while they were still a UK resident. Some countries already do this for capital gains when people emigrate. For example, the US already has an exit tax for certain wealthy expatriates. Norway also approved a higher exit tax to ensure those leaving pay up on the way out. Additionally, renegotiating tax treaties to include wealth taxes or collaborating on information sharing can help. While we might not get a global wealth tax treaty overnight, the trend is towards greater tax cooperation, like the recent global minimum corporate tax deal. If momentum builds, say the EU or a coalition of willing countries all enact wealth taxes, it will reduce tax haven options for the rich and make the policy far more effective. Designing a good tax is also not just a technical exercise but a political one. To ensure a wealth tax works, it must have public support and be safeguarded against repeal by future governments. This means engaging with the public and stakeholders from the start, running consultations, publishing papers explaining how the tax will operate, and being transparent about how the revenue will be used can build trust. It's also wise to implement the tax in a way that's highly visible in its benefits. If citizens see new schools, hospitals, or climate programs funded by wealth tax, essentially seeing the money put to good use, they'll be far more likely to defend the tax's continuation. One reason some European wealth taxes faltered is that their benefits weren't clear to the average person, while the downside, like a few famous rich people leaving, were extremely visible in the media. I'd also add that communication is such an important part here, and that social media platforms need to be used better for left-wing policies, as people truly just don't understand the impact and just think of the emotional response. Like, just looking at the government taking away 200k from someone and being like, hey, that isn't right, but not actually looking at the fact that they're still making 800k pure profit in just 1 year, which is crazy compared to the median salary. So, to conclude, really, many countries have tried wealth taxes and they've been shown to work when implemented well.